Hello again, folks. Welcome to our latest AstroTalk. And today, our topic is what's your lunar type, or the 8 phases of a lunar cycle. What inspired me to do this was this article that I stumbled upon. Witches are trying to figure out who gave Trump COVID. Especially this phrase, the COVID diagnosis fell on a suspiciously auspicious date. A lot of witches have been hexing Trump for a very long time, the article claims. And they timed it during the full moon. And what's great is that this particular October 2020, we had 2 full moons, one on the first day and one on the very last day. Funny, but the relationship between the moon, witches, and the supernatural is a thick one. Kawawang moon, no? Well, maybe it's because Western thought is not comfortable with notions like darkness, feelings and emotions, and generally women with balls. But not in astrology. In astrology, men and women are on equal basis when you talk about them planet-wise. Especially in the type of astrology I enjoy the most, which is humanistic or person-centered astrology, not predictive astrology. Which brings me back to my idol, none other than the man himself, Dane Rudier, noted astrologer and philosopher and all-around fantastic guy. I got introduced to him because of his seminal book, Astrology of Personality, in the late 60s and early 70s. And one of the books that he also authored was called The Lunation Cycle, which will be the subject of today's talk. And there he says that the lunation cycle basically is a cycle of relationships, a relationship between the sun and the moon. Which brings us to today's major players, our beloved sun, which represents the male principle, yang energy, the power of will, and fire from within. And then we have Luna, or the moon, which represents the female principle, yin energy, feelings and emotions, and reflected light. Along with, of course, our beloved playground, okay, the sandbox of their relationship, which is the earth. Now here's how the three work together. So picture this. This is the earth. And on one side, we have the sun. What's crucial to know is that the sun does not move, but from the point of view of the earth, the sun revolves around it against the background of the stars. Then we have the moon. And the moon in itself goes around our planet. The way it's pictured here is a full moon, okay, with the earth in between the moon and the sun. But the actual beginning of the lunar cycle is a new moon. And the new moon, it starts an 8-phased cycle as follows. So 45 degrees into its orbit around the earth, we have the crescent moon, and around 90-degree point, the first quarter, and around 135-degree point is the gibbous moon. We have the full moon, a disseminating moon, the third quarter, and closing the cycle is the balsamic moon. So the lunation cycle, as you saw, is a cycle of relationships between the movement of the sun and the movement of the Earth and the movement of the Moon. It's important to note that at this point, a typical solar cycle runs from 0 degrees Aries to the last degree of Pisces as viewed from the Earth. While the Moon, its cycle is measured from one new moon to the next new moon as viewed from the Earth. And maybe at this point, I'll show you how it looks. I've set up my favorite astrology software, SolarFire, to show us the chart of the incoming new moon on the 17th of October. The sun and the moon will be together in 23 degrees 53 minutes of Libra. And this is how a typical lunation cycle would look like. So the moon begins its movement. Let's go back a bit. You see that red line? That's around the time of the beginning of the crescent phase, okay? When the moon is 45 degrees ahead of the sun. And then let's pause again and I'll show you there. This is the time around the 23rd of October of the first quarter of the moon. Okay, and when the moon is around 135 degrees ahead of the sun, this is the beginning of the gibbous moon phase. Okay, and as I mentioned, the second full moon of October happens exactly on Halloween night, 9:38 p.m. in Manila, Philippines. So you see that the sun and the moon are opposite each other. That means the moon is 180 degrees away from the sun. Let's continue. Okay. Let's look for that. There it is. Okay, there. So circa the 4th of November, exciting day for America. The moon will begin its disseminating phase, okay, when it's 135 degrees closing in on the sun. So, and by the 9th of the 8th or 9th of November, the third quarter of the moon begins. The moon is 90 degrees closing in on the sun. Okay, and finally, when the moon is about 45 degrees closing in on the sun, that's the start of the balsamic or the last phase of the lunar cycle, and prepares for the next new moon, which shall be on around the 15th of November. So you can see the movement of the moon in relation to the sun defines 8 of the major phases of a lunation cycle. What we're looking at now are the 8 phases of the moon superimposed against the solar calendar of 360 degrees or 365 days. And each of the 8 phases would have its own significance. So that's Apollo and his twin sister Artemis, the goddess of the moon, and Apollo is, of course, Lord of the sun. And each of the phases blend into one another. Each cycle is composed mainly of 2 broad strokes, a waxing cycle and a waning cycle. So the waxing period is composed basically of 4 phases, sub-phases. So the first phase is the new moon phase. If you'd like to read this in detail, you can just pause the video. And circa 45 degrees, the moon goes into its crescent phase. And around the first quarter, the moon is 90 degrees ahead of the sun. And around 135 degrees, the moon begins its gibbous cycle. The meanings are lifted from the page that's a tribute to Dane Rudyard, the Chaldea.com page. So if you want to read more about it, just please go to the site. I'm listing down the keynotes, or the keywords for each subphase. So the waning phase is likewise divided into 4 sub-cycles. So the full moon cycle, the disseminating moon cycle. Again, if you want to read it in detail, you can just pause the video. The last quarter cycle, and finally, the balsamic moon cycle. So, as I mentioned, each of the cycles flow into one another. Okay. The key words for the waning period are okay, so let's look at the 8 lunation types. And to help us out with this, I'm going to use some examples from cinema. So if you were born with the moon around the time of the new moon to 45 degrees distance between the sun and the moon, you belong to the new moon type. The keywords are you're a very subjective, emotional, and impulsive individual. It's like the first sign of the Zodiac, Aries. You're an emerging being, getting used to a totally different environment. Again, if you want to read this in detail, just kindly pause the video. So if I'm going to use some of my favorite film, I'd use, of course, the first part of the Apu trilogy, which is Panther Panchali, okay, which shows a young boy encountering the world around him. Another film that I think exemplifies these 2 principles would be 400 Blows by Francois Truffaut. We have the little boy again encountering a strange world wherein everything seems a bit alien compared to what is in her life. If you were born with your moon 45 degrees ahead to 90 degrees of the sun, okay, you can find this in any reputable online astrology site. I suggest looking at AstroTalk for a free chart computation of your birth chart. Okay. Again, the meanings are lifted from Chaldea.com. Okay. So if you're a crescent moon type, the keywords are determined self-assertiveness. So you have from a new moon, which is the feeling of being thrown or projected into a world not of your own making. The individual now begins to move in the world. That's still alien, but it's a world that signifies a lot of struggling against. Okay? And if I'm going to use films that signify the principle of aggressive self-assertions, I'd use Orson Welles' Citizen Kane, which is really all about the power of an individual's will, impressing itself on an alien or even a hostile environment. Another film that I think exemplifies the crescent moon type is Clockwork Orange by Stanley Kubrick, which is an individual who does not care for social mores, who doesn't care for traditional, conventional behavior. Okay, so a self-assertion. So who else but our protagonist from Clockwork Orange would be a best. So our protagonist from Clockwork Orange. So our Bida from Clockwork Orange would be a perfect example of this type of character. If you're born with your moon 90 degrees to 135 degrees ahead of the sun, you belong to the first quarter type. 90 degrees is the degree of energy spent on building up activities. So the energy is spent into building one's cocoon or base of operations, or just building a safe space in your own environment. So the key words is for this to happen, you need strong will and organizing ability. And the films which I think represent the principles of building up a home base would be our very own Biyaya ng Lupa, which is about a family trying to make its mark in relation to the land in a small town called Santa Monica. Okay? In 1959, Filipino film by Manuel Silos. Another one that represents the idea of family as the center of one's being is, of course, Ladri di Bicicleti by Vittorio De Sica, or Bicycle Thieves. Okay. If you were born with your moon 135 degrees to 180 degrees away from the sun, or just before the full moon, you belong to the gibbous moon type. Okay, the keywords are desire to improve yourself on others. The gibbous moon represents an evaluation of where you are and an acceptance of the need to adjust. Okay, so people born during this period are always self-questioning, and I think the films that represent this type of thinking, okay, so they're into health, they're into well-being, they're into trying to be as efficient a cog in the wheel. Of course, it's modern times. And another one, a more recent one, would be Roma, okay, by Cuaron, which centered on the life of a helper. Okay. Now, around the time of the full moon, you have now reached the culmination of the lunation cycle, the midpoint. And so from pure self-awareness, the essence of the new moon, the individual now is completely aware of himself and his role in society. So it's a cycle of objectivity. Other keywords for the full moon include illumination and enlightenment. This is perhaps because it's believed that Buddha gained his enlightenment, or Siddhartha gained enlightenment during a night of a full moon. So some examples from film of an individual now trying to relate to others would be Persona by Ingmar Bergman. We have two characters melding into one another. one character dissolving into the other. Okay. Another film would be Shang Yinu's Raise the Red Lantern, wherein you have an individual that's forced to deal with other individuals. Gong Li has to scheme her way through this household in order to survive. So the full moon is really a cycle of the individual trying to make his mark, her mark with other individuals, trying to blend in. If you were born with the moon 225 degrees to 270 degrees ahead of the sun, you would have a disseminating moon type. I have a disseminating moon type. And so after the initial encounter with other people, we learn to share or disseminate ideas or demonstrate to others what we have learned. So the films, I think, that represent the idea of sharing resources or sharing one's talents would be Cinema Paradiso. So the idea that the projectionist lives his life sharing his dreams via the medium of cinema, and it's passed on to the young boy. Okay. Another film which I think exemplifies sharing of energies would be Abu Dessouf by Jean-Luc Godard. It's about a petty criminal and a very idealistic young lady, and how each of their worldviews interpenetrate one another. Okay. Very whimsical. We reach the last quarter of the lunation cycle. If you are born with the moon 270 degrees to 315 degrees ahead of the sun. Okay. So the keywords for the last quarter, as I mentioned, if you want to read this in detail, you can just pause the video, is the ability to manage and organize people. So around the last quarter, okay, or the third quarter, the individual is a fully functional social, political, and cultural animal. From an emerging idea of selfhood and the new moon to a soul that's just beginning to build its mark in the first quarter, to an individual dealing with the rest of the world and other individuals during the full moon. We have the individual working as a planetary being. So that means we're into movements and we're into managing and organizing systems, okay, effective systems. So I think one of the films that represent this idea would be Fritz Lang's Metropolis, the idea of technology as overpowering world. And aside from this, if we are going to talk politics, and I think one of the most overtly political films would be Bertolucci's Novecento. So we see the clash between the rich and the poor, the peasants versus the landowners, and the socialists versus the fascists. So third quarter types are into collectives. And finally, the last phase of the lunation cycle is the balsamic moon phase, which happens when the moon is 315 degrees away from the sun, or actually just 45 degrees away to the next full moon. The keywords for this cycle, bringing the past to a conclusion. So balsamic moon types seem to be not of this world because they're so used to the idea of life structures crumbling around them in preparation for what they feel is going to be a new cycle. Okay, so the films that for me represent this would be Ikiru by Akira Kurosawa, where the old protagonist learns to confront his own mortality. Okay. Another film would be The Cabinet of Caligari, which to me represents the fantasy or the dream aspect of the balsamic moon types as they stand on the threshold between a cycle that's crumbling and a cycle that's still about to be born. Just to cite a few examples, of course, this is from Fellini's Roma. But wait, let me give you my rose gallery of examples concerning lunation types, and we can start with So I guess that's it, folks. So that's my parting question. Thank you for your time, and happy lunation cycle hunting.